Hello everybody. Today we're going to do the Prairie Lab, and for this lab I am at CLC's Grayslake campus, and we have a lot of natural areas that we maintain on campus, and as you can see behind me is our Prairie natural area. And as you can see, this is from the sign, this is a restored prairie. You know, Illinois was once 60% prairie, and in fact one of Illinois' nicknames is the Prairie State. But most of that prairie was lost. A lot of it was converted into agricultural land. Today, less than 0.01% of that original prairie actually remains. So a lot of the prairie areas that you find around the state are restored prairies, and we'll talk a little bit more about restorations as we go through this. So let's get started. Let's start walking through and talk about prairie ecosystems. One of the things that you'll notice as we walk around in the prairie is there are very few woody plant species here. So not many bushes, not many trees. A prairie is characterized by having almost all herbaceous plant species. Herbaceous means non-woody. So in the prairie we find a lot of grasses and forbs. Forbs are herbaceous plant species other than grasses. So a prairie is a type of grassland, and we'll do another grassland ecosystem lab in a few weeks when we visit the savanna. And we'll talk when we do that lab about how savannas are different than prairies. Obviously they're similar since they're both grasslands in that they both have a lot of grasses growing in them. And then we'll also do some wetland labs and a forest lab, so we'll learn about some other ecosystem types as well. As you can see walking through, our prairie has a lot of grasses and not so many forbs. This is a restored prairie. It was restored back in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of grass species were planted here, and they pretty much took over, and they're dominating this prairie. There are some forbs here, but not nearly as many as the grasses. And the grasses form a pretty, dense amount of vegetation here, and they're outcompeting the forbs for space, for sunlight. So it's a little bit hard for the forbs to spread, but there are some here. So we can see here some brown seed heads for some of the forb species. So in a restoration, there's several steps, several things you have to do to restore an ecosystem. One of the first things you have to do, obviously, is remove any species that you don't want to be there. So this area was farmland before it was bought by the college, and I don't actually know if it was, if anything happened to it between when it was farmland and between when the prairie was restored here. But if, for instance, they planted turf grass here or something else was planted here, then one of the first things that would have to happen is you'd have to remove those species that you didn't want here, that were not appropriate for the type of ecosystem that you're restoring. The second thing that commonly has to happen is there might be physical changes that need to happen to the site. So for instance, in Illinois, we actually get a lot of rainfall, and so a lot of Illinois tended to be pretty wet. The soil would hold that moisture throughout the year. And a lot of the grasslands were converted over into agricultural land, so people farmed on them. And if you're going to grow crops in land, you don't want that soil to be wet all throughout the year. So in Illinois, it was really common when the prairies were turned into agricultural land that people installed drain tiles. Drain tiles are perforated pipes that were buried in the ground, and when it would rain, rather than the soil remaining wet, the water would drain down into those pipes, and then the pipes would take it off to the nearest, lake or river or wherever. Well, the native species are adapted to those conditions. If it rains, they're used to water remaining in the soil for a period of time. That's what they're adapted to. That's what many of them need. So another change that has to happen when you're restoring certain ecosystems is removing those materials like the drain tiles that may have been put in, or physical changes that may have been done to the topography of the land to bring it back to a physical condition that the native species are adapted to and that they're going to be able to thrive in. And then obviously the last thing you have to do if you're doing a restoration is you have to bring in the species that are native to the ecosystem that you're restoring, the species that you want to have there. So in a prairie, a lot of grasses. So some of the more common grasses in prairies in our area would be big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, and little blue stem. And I think I've seen all of those species in this prairie. It's a little bit hard to identify them now because, as you can see, it's late spring right now, so the seed heads, which would have been easily identifiable last fall, having gone through the winter, the birds have picked them clean. The snow has compacted a lot of them down. It's a little bit tough to identify stuff. This right here, though, I can just make out is Indian grass. This is very common in prairies in our area. And then I can see in here some switchgrass growing right here. So this is a little clump of switchgrass right here. But there's also a lot of little blue stem. I can see it. Obviously it's a finer leafed plant. It's a smaller plant than the others. And I can't see any right now, but I know there's a lot of big blue stem here as well. And then obviously all of the forbs as well. So here's some common forbs in prairie in our area. This is a species of goldenrod. The most common goldenrod in our prairies is Canada goldenrod, which is probably what this is, but there are a number of other species that can be found here as well. Here's a leaf for another forb that you find in our area. This is a leaf for compass plant. Compass plant is in the genus Silphium, and one of the things that's interesting about this is it has really thick, rough leaves. They almost feel like sandpaper, and that probably evolved to deter herbivores. So any mammal herbivores, if they would chew on this, it would wear down their teeth over time, which obviously would be a problem. If their teeth get worn down, they wouldn't be able to eat anymore. So this is probably an adaptation to protect this plant from being eaten too much by herbivores. And this got its name compass plant because early settlers thought that the leaves always grew facing north-south, which I think would be about right here. But they don't. You find these leaves growing in every which direction. So I don't know, all you have to do is look at 3 plants and realize the leaves don't all grow in the same direction. So I'm not quite sure why it got that name. This plant here is Prairie dock, which is also in the genus Silphium. So it's a relative of the compass plant. And you can see there's this tall flower stalk here. It's covered in yellow flowers in late summer. And then the leaves are these enormous broadleaf leaves. This one's, browned and curled up. but these are really striking leaves in the summer when the plant is growing. And again, it has that same texture as the compass plant, really thick, very rough and sandpaper. You can see on the back that texture really looks like sandpaper and protects these plants from herbivores. Oh, look here, we have some signs of wildlife. So there's some animal scat here, and I can tell this is probably coyote. If you look closely at it, there's a lot of fur and hair left over in this. So wild animals eat their prey, and they eat every part of them, fur and hair and bones and teeth and everything included. So it's very easy to tell that this is wild animal scat and not somebody's dog. And based on the size, I would guess coyote. It's big enough that it's probably not any smaller animal. Here's a sign of another animal that's pretty common to find in grasslands. So this probably just looks like a pile of dirt, but if I lift this up, underneath we're going to find a burrow. So there's a burrow going down, and if you see these, people often think, oh, maybe that's a snake burrow or a chipmunk or a mouse or something like that. This is actually a crayfish burrow. So there are a number of species of crayfish that dig these burrows, and you think of crayfish as an aquatic organism, and this is obviously, there's no water on the surface here, but the thing is, remember, we get a lot of rain in Illinois, so what they do is they dig down, and just a couple of feet under the ground there's going to be water. So the crayfish dig down until they find groundwater, and they're able to survive in their burrow in the water. And then at night they come out and they forage on whatever they can find. So the younger crayfish are much more predatory. I don't know if you can see, there's an isopod right here. That would definitely be food for a younger crayfish. Older crayfish tend to be more herbivorous, so they'll come out and they'll graze on all of this vegetation here. Let me put this back. Obviously, this crayfish has capped off its burrow, so we'll put that back on for it. So, as I said earlier, a characteristic of prairies is that they are dominated by grasses and forbs, and there are very few woody species in a prairie. But if you remember back to, I think it was module 2.3 in the text, we learned about ecological succession. And a grassland is kind of a middle successional ecosystem. And grasslands, through ecological succession, are going to be replaced by woodlands, by shade-intolerant forests and then shade-tolerant forests. So there's a couple of things that can happen in prairies that stop ecological succession from happening, stop trees from taking over. First of all, prairies tend to be found in places where there's enough rainfall for the grasses and the forbs, but not quite enough for woody species like trees. So one of the interesting characteristics about these plants is that they have very deep root systems. So in Illinois, we have tallgrass prairie, and tallgrass prairie plants might be, they can get as high as 10, 12 feet actually, although more commonly what you see is maybe about 6 feet high, but they can get taller than that. But what a lot of people don't realize is the roots of these plants often go down as deep or even deeper than the plant is tall. So it's not uncommon for prairie plants to have roots that are 10, 12, even 15 feet deep. So even if we go through a period, a month or even 2 months where we don't get any rain, if you were to dig down 10 feet deep, the soil would still be moist. And so these plants are able to survive periods of little rain. Whereas if we look over towards the buildings, and you see there's some tall trees over there. I'm at a distance, so I can't quite identify all of them. Some of those look like linden trees to me. Some of them look like they might be oaks. But if we look at those trees, those are, I don't know, 50 feet high, 60 feet high, maybe higher. And if I were to ask you how deep their roots go, usually a lot of students will say very deep. But you'd be surprised then to find out that the roots of those trees probably only go maybe 3 feet deep. So whereas the prairie plants have roots that go very deep, they pretty much just go straight down, tree roots don't go down, they spread outwards. So if a tree is 60 feet tall, its roots probably spread 60 feet across. They just don't go very deep. They only go 2 or 3 feet down, but they're very wide. The thing with a root system like that, though, is if it doesn't rain for a month, the surface of the soil, and even 2-3 feet down, is going to be totally dry. And so the trees can't survive that. So trees, woody species, require a certain level of rainfall. The prairie species require less. So you find prairies in places where either there's just enough rain for the grasses and forbs, not enough for the trees, or like Illinois, we actually get a lot of rain. The annual rainfall for Illinois is quite high, but it's very common for us to have a month or two in the summer of no rain. Prairie species can survive that. Trees have a tougher time with that, especially younger trees. Another mechanism that's important in prairies for stopping ecological succession is fire. So even before humans were around to set the fires, prairies would burn naturally from, lightning strikes and other things that might have happened to light off fires. You can see at this time of year, this vegetation is all dead and it's dry. So the thing about species in the prairies is they are perennial plants. Perennials survive from year to year, but it's the below ground part of the plant that survives. The root systems of these plants survived the winter down in the soil, and in another couple of months, they will sprout new stems and leaves. The above ground part of the plant dies back every year though. So in the fall, all of these stems and leaves died and potentially could burn if there was a fire. But the roots, again, were protected in the soil, protected from the harsh temperatures of winter, survived, and they'll sprout again here at some point this spring. So if a fire were to burn through here, all of this stuff would burn, but it would not hurt the prairie plants at all. As opposed to this rose shrub that we have growing here. So the above ground parts of this plant are still alive. Well, some of these branches have died, but you can see the reddish colored branches, those are still alive. But if a fire were to burn through here, and it were a large enough fire that this bush were to catch on fire, all of that material would be killed. All of those living branches would die, and that might be enough to kill the bush. So whereas a fire doesn't hurt the prairie plants, for woody species, especially smaller woody species, shrubs like this and tree saplings, it could be fatal, and it often is. So fires are very common in tall grass prairies. Remember, we tend to get a lot of rainfall. So even though we have those droughts, it might be possible for trees to survive. So fires are a really important management tool. And if you drive around natural areas in the fall and spring, it's not uncommon to see controlled burns happening, where site managers are actually burning grasslands to try to maintain that ecosystem and keep trees from taking over. And a lot of the prairie species, actually, they benefit from that. The fire burns a lot of this vegetation, which recycles nutrients back into the soil. It exposes the soil so it can warm up faster from the sun, which can speed up this year's growth. And some prairie species, their seeds can't germinate unless there's been a fire. So some species can't even reproduce without the fire. One of the tricks, though, to doing controlled burns is you want to be sure you do it at the right time. If you do controlled burns too late in the spring, some of the plants might already have started sprouting, and some migratory species might have showed up and started nesting in the prairie. And obviously a burn would be damaging to all of those species. Another benefit of the controlled burns is that it helps to control non-native species. So if you look ahead, all of the tall grasses that are growing there, that's a non-native grass called Phragmites. And as you can see, it forms dense stands of itself and it outcompetes the native species. Phragmites, though, is not tolerant of burning. So burning is a real effective tool in trying to control Phragmites and allow the natives to still survive in areas where the Phragmites is trying to take over. I mentioned several times tallgrass prairie. Here in Illinois and Indiana, Iowa, northern Missouri, tallgrass prairie is the type of prairie that you find. As you move west towards the Rocky Mountains, you get into mixed grass prairie. When you get into Nebraska and areas of that longitude. And then once you get into Colorado, right up against the Rocky Mountains, is short grass prairie. And the reason for the differences are mostly due to rainfall. In the shortgrass prairie, there's very little rainfall because as the wind blows over the top of the Rocky Mountains, it gets cold and it has to drop all of its moisture. So the wind that blows down over the Rocky Mountains onto like eastern Colorado is very, very dry. So you have shortgrass prairie there because the species that are able to survive, there's very, very little moisture. So even the grasses and forbs that you find growing there aren't very tall. You know, they're scrubby 2 to 3 foot grasses. And fire is not as common in the shortgrass prairie. Because it is so dry, fire can actually be really dangerous in those ecosystems. Then as you head farther east, you get into the mixed grass prairie, and then eventually again to the tall grass prairie here. The mixed grass prairie, I think it's obvious by its name, is a mix of species from the shortgrass and the tall grass prairies. Well, that was the prairie. I hope you found that interesting. Obviously, there was not much growing. The prairie looks pretty brown in the springtime. One of the characteristics of the prairie is because there's no shade in the summer and early fall, there's tons of sunlight. So prairie plants do not sprout early in the spring. They wait for things to warm up, and that's when they start to grow. So at this point in the spring, this is mid to late March right now, prairies tend to look pretty brown. If we were to come back here in June, we would see a lot more green happening. And then July, August, and September, there'd be a lot of green and a lot of flowering happening. So this is just a time of year where this is what the prairie looks like. But I hope you found that interesting, and I'll see you for the next lab.